So what if I told you there was once a drug based on marijuana research that was legal at the time that promised effortless weight loss and became a blockbuster drug almost overnight with its release. And then just as quickly, it disappeared. Pulled from shelves, banned from multiple countries, and connected to some of the darkest side effects ever seen in a weight loss medication. And that's saying something. Today, we're going to be diving into one of the most fascinating forgotten pharmaceuticals, a drug called Rimonabant. This drug wasn't some experimental compound hidden in a lab or a research chemical. It was actually prescribed to thousands of patients all across the world. And yet, just as quickly as it came to fame, it vanished. So what happened to Rimonabant? Let's break down the rise, the fall, and the possible future for Rimonabant. To understand Rimonabant, we've got to rewind and talk about a different drug you definitely know about, marijuana. Weed has been used for thousands of years, both for medicinal purposes and for recreation. But for a long time, no one knew exactly how it made you high. That changed in 1942 when a group of scientists from the USDA and Cornell Medical School managed to extract THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, the actual molecule that mainly produces the high feeling from the plant, but didn't fully crack the code. These early extracts were a mix of delta-8 and delta-9, as well as their enantiomers, so they couldn't fully separate and synthesize delta-9 THC. The big breakthrough came in 1964 when Israeli chemist Raphael Mechoulam isolated and synthesized both enantiomers of delta-9 THC, the main compound responsible for feeling high, and what you'll see a lot these days in medical marijuana. But that raised a new question. How does delta-9 THC and other cannabinoids that produce a high feeling actually work? Some scientists thought that the shape of the molecule just caused disorder in cells, and that the erratic result caused was the feeling of being high in the brain. But that theory fell apart in the mid-1980s when a lab at St. Louis University found definitive proof of cannabinoid receptors. How they did this was using a method called radiolabeled ligands to determine where and if there was a cannabinoid receptor. What radiolabeled ligands are is you attach a radioactive isotope, in this case tritium, to a full agonist for a certain receptor. In this case, it was CP55940, which I actually talk about in another video on this channel. In this case, delta-9 THC wouldn't work because it's only a partial agonist. It's not a full agonist. CP55940 is a full agonist, meaning its binding affinity is way stronger. So doing this experiment in rat brains, they found that there was a massive accumulation of this tritium, which was attached to this molecule in the rat's central and peripheral nervous systems, showing that there was a certain marker for CB1 receptors. In 1990, they were able to successfully isolate and clone the CB1 receptor, CB1 being cannabinoid receptor 1. There's also the CB2 receptor, which also plays a part in making you feel high and is something that cannabinoids also agonize. But now that we knew exactly how THC worked, this was about the time when pharmaceutical companies started paying attention. So you might be wondering, why would a pharmaceutical company want to mess with the receptor that gets you high? Well, it's not just about euphoria. If you ever smoked weed, you probably noticed something else too. It makes you really, really hungry. The CB1 receptor plays a huge role in appetite regulation. The CB1 receptor plays a huge role in appetite regulation. Activate it and you'll be eating way more than you normally would be. I think everyone knows that. But here's the trick. You can both block it, or better yet, inversely agonize it. Doing this, you can suppress appetite. Here's a quick analogy. Think of a light switch. If you were to flip a light switch on, the light turns on. If you were to flip the light switch off, the light would turn off. What if there's a third mode, a part underneath the off part of the light switch that when you flip to it, sucked all the light out of a room? Instead of just being absent of light, the light would actually suck any residual light in the room out of the room, making the room overall darker. This is what inverse agonization kind of is. Because the CB1 receptor increases appetite when you activate it, an inverse agonist, if used on the CB1 receptor, would then theoretically suppress appetite. And this is exactly how Rimonabant works. As a CB1 inverse agonist, it tightly binds the CB1 receptor, doing the opposite of what it normally would do if it was just agonized. This is the core of what an inverse agonist does. It doesn't just block activity, it reverses it. And of course, this is a very simple explanation for a very complex topic. I mean, people have built entire careers off just understanding how receptors work and all the different effects down the line of chemical reactions in a cell. However, for the purposes of this video, just understand that inverse agonization reverses the effect of receptor, whereas agonization activates it. Okay, so in 1999, pharmaceutical giant Sanofi-Aventis developed Rimonabant, a selective CB1 inverse agonist. If marijuana gives you the munchies, Rimonabant gives you the starvies. I don't know. But the point is it stops you from being hungry. It suppresses appetite. And when they were testing it, both internally and during clinical trials, results looked great. Animal trials were going well, and human trials were super promising. Meta-analyses of all their trial data confirmed that there was meaningful weight loss, reduced waist circumference, and improvements in metabolic risk factors. Even better, there were very few concerning biomarkers. Most biomarkers that were present were already associated with weight loss, so they just weren't much of a concern. In 2006, the European Medicines Commission approved Rimonabant for use in patients with high BMI and obesity-related conditions. Soon, Mexico and Brazil followed suit. But the FDA said no in that same year. So what happened? Now, you might blame the FDA not approving Rimonabant on something like bureaucracy or corruption, but the FDA did have some very good reasons. The same clinical trials I mentioned earlier, well, I left some stuff out. The most common side effects weren't something you can measure through biomarkers. They were psychological. The most common side effects were depression, anxiety, and nausea. About 10% of all patients reported some sort of mood alteration, and these are all negative. And even worse, 1% of patients developed suicidal ideation. During FDA clinical trials, tragically, at least 2 patients on Rimonabant died via suicide during the trials. The FDA killed Rimonabant before it was even put to market. In Europe, regulators initially brushed this off, advising that people with psychiatric conditions avoid the drug, but the FDA wasn't convinced. They concluded that Rimonabant's psychiatric risks outweighed its benefits, and without FDA approval, Sanofi's golden goose was completely dead. The US market was by far the most profitable market for pharmaceutical drugs, period, ignoring the fact this was a weight loss drug. 10% of all US healthcare expenditure is just for treating healthcare-related conditions in the United States. So a weight loss drug would do incredible here, and if it couldn't get approved in the United States, you might as well not sell it. By 2008, the European Medicines Commission reevaluated the drug and pulled it from the market. Brazil, Mexico, and India and other countries soon followed. Sanofi officially discontinued Rimonabant in 2009, stopping production and sale everywhere. Interestingly, all of the common side effects of Rimonabant are things that medical marijuana is often prescribed to treat today. Of course, this might seem obvious now, but in the 2000s, people were just warming up to the idea of marijuana not being an addictive gateway drug and being a potential medicine. Research on cannabinoids had been heavily regulated for years, and much of the research that Sanofi and other groups had to go off of were just those initial 1960 and 1980 papers. They basically had nothing. At the time, if there had been something like Biden's Medical Marijuana Research Act, then clinical researchers may have more clearly understood THC's benefits and been more cautious with an inverse agonist like Rimonabant. But ultimately, that wasn't what happened, and a lot of money and maybe even some lives were wasted as a result. This goes to show that when it comes to science, regulation and restriction of information simply isn't a good idea, and it can cost lives and money. So what was it like to actually take Rimonabant? Well, probably not very pleasant, but I really have no idea. I don't smoke weed myself. It makes me very anxious, and something like Rimonabant, I mean, that just sounds like a bad combination. And there are no trip reports. Because the drug was only approved for a short period of time, given a select number of patients, and trip reports weren't a huge thing in 2008 and 2007, you simply can't find them. And people really didn't want to experiment with it recreationally because it just doesn't sound like a good time. I mean, to me, it sounds like it might be like a day tour or a DPH trip with less hallucinations and more external dread. So I don't know if anyone would even want to take it. And while it's still technically possible to buy the Rimonabant molecule through research chemical sites like Cayman, for a recreational dose, you're probably going to be paying $200 to $300, depending on where you get it from. And that's just not economical. And who knows, it probably won't even do anything. But if you want to experiment with your body and you have $300 to burn, then the option is there. But you're going to have to get around the fact that research chemical sites probably won't deliver to your residential address. But if you can get around that and you want to spend some money, then I guess you could buy some and maybe permanently alter your brain chemistry in the process. Okay, so is there a future for Rimonabant? Probably not, at least in its current form. Today we've got much safer options like Ozempic and Mounjaro for weight loss without all the intense psychological side effects. So there's really no reason to try and bring Rimonabant back. That being said, CB1 inverse agonists might make a comeback for treating things like fatty liver disease or type 2 diabetes if scientists can develop a version that can't cross the blood-brain barrier, avoiding a lot of the nasty mental side effects. The CB1 receptors are localized in the peripheral and central nervous systems. So if the molecule can't get into the central nervous system, then, well, you could eliminate those side effects, at least theoretically. Also, Rimonabant has some other weird side effects you probably didn't know about. For one, it increases GABA A receptor response in a very roundabout way that I don't want to get into. But it's the same receptor that alcohol acts on, meaning if you were to drink on Rimonabant, there might be an increased response, similar to like benzodiazepines, for example. Maybe. I don't know. There's not much experimental data. It also acts as a mu-opioid receptor antagonist, the same receptor fentanyl and morphine binds to. It's not nearly as strong as naloxone, but it could potentially interfere with opioid effects. This could be of concern if someone was prescribed both Rimonabant and an opioid at the same time. And they didn't even know this back when it was prescribed. So, yeah. So, what are my final thoughts? The spirit of Rimonabant isn't entirely dead. For CB1 inverse agonists, look up THCV. It's a sort of obscure cannabinoid that naturally suppresses appetite, just like Rimonabant. But it is an agonist for the CB2 receptor. I might even do a whole video about it myself. I really like learning about cannabinoids, and THCV is one of the most unique, honestly. But for now, Rimonabant remains a case study in what happens when you have a seemingly promising drug, but you restrict research surrounding other molecules that are related to it. If there was more marijuana research around this period of time, then Rimonabant might have never been approved, and we might have saved a lot of money and lives in the process. But if you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, comment. I might, if I get enough views, get enough likes, I might try and see if I can get some Rimonabant myself. It's one of my favorite compounds ever, just because its story is so unique and it's quite obscure, I'd say. So I definitely belongs in the obscure drug category. So if I get my hands on some, I might write that first ever trip report that seemingly is completely absent from the internet. So, give this video a like. It might happen. Thank you.